In 1942, the great Austrian writer Stefan Zweig ended his life along with his wife Lotte in their house in Brazil. He was far away from his home in Austria, and looking at his Europe, he couldn't believe what was happening to it. He was despairing for its future. He had just 8 years earlier left his illustrious career in his home country of Austria to flee the Ständerstaat regime, the conservative Catholic fascist regime that had couped the government in 1934, suspending the parliament indefinitely and banning several left-wing parties. Zweig fled to London, and in the years leading into the war he would stay there, sometimes moving in between London and Bath. However, as the tension in Europe rose, his feeling was that not even the Great British Empire would he be safe. You see, Stefan Zweig was Jewish, and in interwar Europe this was a dangerous thing to be. So in 1940 he took his wife and a couple of boxes and moved briefly to New York before finally settling in Petropolis, a German-speaking settlement in the state of Rio de Janeiro. As someone who became a refugee and resettled twice in his life, he had few belongings when he came to Brazil, maybe just a couple of boxes of stuff left from his vast collection of knickknacks from famous European artists. Zweig was an art lover, and very much held up European art for its humanistic qualities. He loved the great European artists like Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Beethoven, Balzac, and many others. He had envisioned his Europe as a future of the humanistic ideals found in many of these artists, where man approached man in dignity and tolerance. Alas, that would not be the future of Europe, and Zweig saw that. What he had found was that his grand idea of what Europe meant had been leveled by an irrational and delusional fixation on racial hierarchy, an antiquated view of gender, petty protection of capital interests, and concentration camps. He looked this abyssal form of Europe in the face, and he couldn't stand to look at it. The Europe he had loved had thoroughly rejected his vision. It was ugly, but it was the truth. Safe in Brazil in the early 1940s, he would rummage through his stuff, the boxes of things that he had left after trekking 3 continents, and found some old copies of the Renaissance writer Michel de Montaigne's essays. It sparked an interest in him, as the work in its humility and liberal tolerance had been exactly the kind of European vision that Zweig himself was championing. Montaigne was himself embroiled in a time of upheaval in Europe. Living through the Reformation, he was living through the violent clashes between the Protestant Huguenots and the Catholics. Seldom a man lives through a more divided Europe than in this period. Zweig found in Montaigne a friend, someone who can understand his anxiety. More than ever, Zweig writes, we owe our knowledge to the ones who reinforce in us a sense of being human in an inhuman epoch like ours. Those who exhort us not to abandon what is ours by right, what we cannot imagine losing, our deepest selves. Only the man who remains free from all and everything augments and sustains freedom on this earth. I also feel nervous in times like ours, just as Zweig did in his. And I have myself turned to both Zweig and Montaigne for a source of comfort while I watch what is going on. It feels as if we're headed towards a great violence, a disfigurement of all for the sake of the very few. And it saddens me. There is something that feels frivolous about writing about anything else than what is currently happening. The news stories feel like they have a gravitational pull which ensnare you into doing circles around its eye. What does it mean to live in times like ours? Are our actions, or rather inactions, showing our character to the generation after us? How can we explain to them what it felt like to live in a time like this? How can we live with ourselves in a time like ours? As the Zweig example demonstrates, there have been many times in history that have felt uncertain, violent, and cruel. A natural idea is to look back into the past and try to collect the thoughts of those who have lived in equally, if not more uncertain times, for guidance. Sigmund Freud wrote an essay about the disillusionment of the non-combatant following the outbreak of World War I. In a sense, he's talking about me, or Stefan Zweig, a contemporary of Freud's. Freud notes the disillusionment of the cosmopolitan man that came from the nationalism that led into World War I. The cosmopolitan Austrian would walk around the streets of Paris, Berlin, London, Warsaw, and Madrid with the same comfort as his native Vienna. He would walk in the magic of northern forests and the splendor of southern vegetation, the mood evoked by landscapes that recall great historical events, and the silence of untouched nature, as Freud so wonderfully put it. But the war popped this illusory balloon with a terrifying bang. After the shock and horror of human suffering had subsided and disillusionment had taken root in the cosmopolitan, Freud could begin his analysis. Freud is something of a cynic when it comes to human beings. He lays bare that humans can be brutal and arbitrary. He does not believe that the cosmopolitan was ever justified to believe such naive things. He says that human beings cannot be classified as either good or bad, but good in certain circumstances and bad in others. We all have egoistic desires, and what separates civilization from its counterpart is the ability to sacrifice our egoistic desires for altruistic means. But many, Freud argues, are not drawn to altruistic behavior instinctually, but rather follow the herd, cultural hypocrites, as he calls it. As soon as the tide turns, when the community no longer raises objections, there is an end, too, to the suppression of evil passions, and people perpetrate deeds of cruelty, fraud, treachery, and barbarity so incompatible with their level of civilization that one would have thought them impossible. We may already derive one consolation from this discussion, Freud concludes. Our mortification and our painful disillusionment on account of the uncivilized behavior of our fellow citizens of the world during this war were unjustified. In reality, our fellow citizens have not sunk so low as we feared, because they'd never risen so high as we believed. But to me, this is no consolation. However, it is helpful sometimes to have someone remind us that too rosy a picture of humans does us no good. Homo homini lupus, as the saying goes, or man is a wolf to man. 1917, Russia. The food was short, the peasants had little land, and they were sending their sons and husbands to be ground up by the German war machine on the Eastern Front. It was not a great time to be a Russian peasant. Well, what time was it ever great to be a Russian peasant? In the years before World War I, there was internal political tensions, and to combat this, the large-scale political repression was orchestrated by the Okhrana, or the Department for the Protection of Public Safety and Order. They were trying to combat increasing political violence against officials by the Socialist Revolutionary Combat Organization. The SR Combat Organization had as its goal to destabilize the current regime by killing government officials, big and small. On July 28, 1904, the Social Revolutionaries kill Minister of the Interior Von Plehve. Von Plehve had helped to instigate the Kishinev pogrom and was brutally repressive to the non-Russian nations in the empire. Only 6-7 months later, the revolutionaries killed Grand Duke Sergei Aleksandrovich, the uncle of Tsar Nicholas Romanov, by throwing a bomb in his carriage. Many American newspapers described the aftermaths to its readers.
On the snow lay fragments of the body of Grand Duke Sergius mingled with the wreck of the carriage. The Grand Duke's head had been torn from his body and reduced to a shapeless pulp, and the trunk and limbs were frightfully mangled. A finger bearing a rich seal was found several yards away. Only a few fragments of cloths indicated that the body had once been clothed.
Despite the gruesome details, much of the American press supported the assassination, with Emma Murdoch of the Wichita Daily Eagle writing that the assassination was not any more of a crime than the shooting down of laboring people in the streets of St. Petersburg who sought unarmed to present a petition to the ruler. Murdoch is here referring to Bloody Sunday, when unarmed peasants followed Georgy Capone to give a petition to Tsar Nicholas, only to be gunned down by soldiers in broad daylight. The revolutionaries had, according to American newspapers, just cause to be angry at the Tsar and his government. But the combat organization killed a lot of people. Estimates put it at around 7,000 people in the 3 years succeeding the First Russian Revolution in 1905. The Okhrana, however, was not much better. While not only ramping up the political repression, they were also ramping up executions, with 2,000 executions happening in the same time frame. Now, one might be quick to think that the secret police was less violent than the revolutionaries just by looking at the numbers. But what is counted as an execution matters. I would be remiss to mention that these statistics didn't include summary executions, killing someone accused of a crime but never tried before a court of law. There were many of those. It also didn't include people who died following their forced relocation to Siberia, which was often a death sentence in itself. My advice is to always be wary of how we define and justify violence. But there are two things that we learn from the revolution. One, the real problem of hunger and shelter had not really been addressed, but rather repressed by the government. And two, that both organizations together were a powder keg for the instability of the empire. The question of violence is always what goals you're trying to achieve with it. Sometimes those goals are just. But something more base is all the more true. Violence begets violence begets violence. The pre-World War II era is today known as appeasement, with the Munich Agreement being a primary compromise between the British and French against the Nazis. The Germans get the Sudetenlands if they pinky promised to not invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Sounds foolproof, right? Just give them what they want and then make them promise to not take any more. We should be very aware that this didn't work. The Nazis later gave Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia a choice at the end of a gun barrel: sign away his country's independence, or lose their independence in a more violent way. While every ideology justifies some violence somewhere, the violence manifest in fascism and Nazism is another degree. Fascists glorify violence, makes it mythological, makes force the only solution, the only language speakable. When you speak to people who are monolingual in the language of violence, it becomes very difficult to communicate with them if not in their own mother tongue. It therefore creates its own instability. And I'm sure that the world felt unstable in the 30s, and that giving the Nazis the Sudetenlands would seemingly calm things down, but people were denying what was to come, what was right in front of them. Because it couldn't happen to us, to me, because it's gonna stop here, right? We already had our Great War. There wasn't a conflict on the horizon. There can't be a conflict on the horizon. While writing this amidst our own uncertain time, I thought about how the First World War had the terrifying Spanish flu in its midst. We haven't had any world wars in our recent past, but we have had pandemics, namely the pandemic of 2020. And many saw the empty streets and felt something akin to an end time approaching. The eeriness of seeing the lifeblood of the city just gone. Does the heart not beat anymore? Is there anybody out there? I'm reminded of Agnolo de Torre, who experienced and chronicled the Black Death firsthand during the 1348 outbreak in Siena, Italy. Agnolo survived to write about the horrifying experience. He lost his wife, Nicoluccia, and his 5 kids to the plague. The mortality began in Siena in May. It was a cruel and horrible thing, and I do not know where to begin to tell of the cruelty and the pitiless ways. It seemed to almost everyone that one became stupefied by seeing the pain, and it is impossible for the human tongue to recount the awful thing. Indeed, one who did not see such horribleness can be called blessed. Father, abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died, and no one could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed that it was the end of the world, and no medicine or any other defense availed. The feeling of complete nothingness and resignation that must have been felt at the thought that this was indeed the end of the world, that death was coming for everyone. However, he makes an observation which feels present to the current moment as well. The city of Siena seemed almost uninhabited, for almost no one was found in the city. And then, when the pestilence abated, all who survived gave themselves over to pleasures. Monks, priests, nuns, and laymen and women all enjoyed themselves, and none worried about spending and gambling, and everyone thought himself rich because he had escaped and regained the world, and no one knew how to allow himself to do nothing. It is as if following times of crisis, there is this need to make the most out of being alive despite the consequences. Because what do I have to lose? Like, fuck it, what could go wrong? We told each other that we would party like no tomorrow once everything opened up again, to let our libidos run amok, to put it in Freudian terms. There is always a day after the plague, as there is a day after every crisis. Agnolo de Tura remarried, but despite this, I doubt he was ever the same man again. We should, however, be mindful that end-time predictions have come about since the beginning. Hundreds of attempts at predicting the end, of civilizational collapse, of utter decimation. It happens so often, in fact, that we've studied this stuff. Historians and other academics study what they call global catastrophe risk. You might be aware of the doomsday clock, where the bulletin of the atomic scientists measure how close we are to midnight, or doomsday. The clock was originally set in 1947, at the beginning of the Cold War, to 7 minutes to midnight. It has been set up and down many times between 1947 and today, with 1952 and the Soviet Union's first nuclear test being the closest to midnight in the clock's history, set at 2 minutes. And there have been some close calls, but it's never felt like death was banging on the door. Although I wouldn't want to be 25 during the saber-rattling of the Second Cold War. But it wasn't up until 2018 when the clock was once again set to 2 minutes to midnight. In 2020, it was adjusted down to 100 seconds to midnight. In 2023, the clock was adjusted to 90 seconds. But the bulletin recently decided that 2025 was another record-breaking year, adjusting the clock just a second closer to 89 seconds to midnight. The beginning of 2026 feels like it could outcompete the entirety of 2025 altogether. It feels ever more true that there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. But who cares if a bunch of nerds have set some imaginary clock to some hypothetical number of imminent doom? Is it even a good metric? Can it ever be? If the clock somehow moves up to 10 minutes to midnight and the A-bomb drops anyway, it won't give us any accurate prediction. It assumes our leaders are rational, thinking for the best of its people. And considering recent events in many countries around the world, that seems highly suspect. The clock is always just a warning shot, a not-so-subtle symbol of the trajectory we're going in. But a warning shot might lose its chilling effect if it doesn't feel threatening or weighty anymore. It just becomes a case of the boy who cried wolf. Not so dissimilar to other doomsday predictions in that regard. End-time predictions very much express the anxiety of the time. The conclusion one could take from this is that there's always just been certain anxieties about being a person, that there's always been this fluctuating feeling that everything is going to collapse at any minute. But people survived and thrived in new environments, says the optimist. Humans survived the Bronze Age collapse. We've survived the fall of Rome. We've survived the Black Death and great famines. And while this optimistic reading is quite nice, it forgets the injustice of those moments. Namely that those who could hide behind castle walls or in their bunkers or far ashore from the coast were less likely to die than any commoner who had no bunker to take cover in. People nowadays have trouble affording shelter and their daily expenses. Are we to assume that they have the equipment to survive the many threats around them? Because while humanity always seems to survive, it's at the cost of all those who die nameless and forgotten. The statistical person who loses their face in the number. They died, alone and undignified. And for what? A notable absence so far is the changing climate and its effects on storms, even now. And don't get me wrong, it will get much worse, and will unfortunately damage so much of what we've built, and disproportionately affect those who had little to do with it in the first place. But I don't feel like I can comment sufficiently in this essay without just adding more to the bloat. But in short, while it will not be the apocalypse, it will make life very hard for many people. And it will cause a lot of suffering to animals, big and small. Although I have gone through different examples now to find some answers, some generality to conclude with, the essay that I was actually looking to write had been written all along. Because I'm certainly not the first person to be writing about living in uncertain times. But I was quite surprised when I'd found this vivid essay about exactly this feeling I'm having in an essay collection I'd recently just bought on a whim. Let's set the scene. Imagine that you're in 17th century England and that you're under the reign of James I. James is absolutist, and during his reign, it seems as if money and fame is all that's cherished. James would often neglect the duty of being king in favor of a scandal-ridden court and a good hunt. In his absolutism, James is laying the foundation for the English Civil War a mere 25 years later. People saw the circumstances and believed that the world must have gone mad somewhere. This is the opinion of Owen Feltham, who wrote the essay, How the Distempers of These Times Should Affect Wise Men. And how should the distempers of our times affect us? He argues that it should make you jolly to see those who do vicious things get their comeuppance. Merry to see how vice flourishes but a while, but at last, frustrate of all her fair hopes, dies in a dejected scorn, which meeting with nothing in the end but beggary, baseness, and contempt. It reminds me of hearing about certain scammy people in our time that many feel the same way about. But this is not the only thing that Feltham observes about his own time. To see how the world is mistaken in opinion, to suppose those best are the wealthiest. To see how men buy offices at higher rates, which, when they have, prove gins to catch their souls in and snare their estates and reputations. Feltham argues that wise people ought to see that those who fall for greed and power over honor and morality are quite literally deceiving themselves about not sullying their souls. While there is a merriment to seeing people who do evil things fall victim to the consequences of their actions, it should actually make any wise person feel crazy to live in a world like this. You should not, according to Feltham, feel as if wealth equals goodness. To live in that world should make wise people feel crazy. But there is an excerpt of this essay which struck me as particularly pertinent to our times, as it summarizes the whole Freudian primitive rot which humans are so tempted to fall into. To see Machiavel's tenets held as oracles, honesty reputed shallowness, justice bought and sold, as if the world went about to disprove Zorobabel and would make him confess money to be stronger than truth. To see how flattery creeps into favor with greatness, while plain dealing is thought the enemy of state and honor. To see how the papists, for promotion of their own religion, invent lies and print them, that they may not only cozen the present age, but gull posterity with forged action. He is sick of politics which seem to merely favor naked power over everything else. He is sick of corruption and greed, and he's sick of the sycophants who cozy up to power, including the church, which prints lies not only to delude current congregations, but congregations for generations to come. Is Feltham not describing our concerns more vividly than I could ever do? And so it is that the thing that hath been, it is what shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. As I'm writing this, the US has just finished bombing and kidnapping Venezuelan head of state Nicolas Maduro. By now, it will have long been eclipsed by another tragedy. But as I read the news, I felt my stomach drop. Not because I have any sort of admiration for Maduro, but because the display of violence sets precedents. Are we now at the point where international law is moot? Are we forgoing our comfortable fictions and letting empire off its leashes to rape and pillage? Are we succumbing to that rotten moral philosophy which is none, that might makes right? It makes me furious to see that people and geography get treated with no more respect than that of a cheap toy. Empires bomb and maim and kill as if they get to do that without recourse, as if it's their duty to kill. Not to mention that it's certainly suspect that the law and order ideologues are the least concerned with the actual follow-through of law and order. Because nothing screams law and order like bombing a sovereign nation without provocation and then kidnapping its leader. And I'm curious to see if the emperors would feel the same way if it were to happen to them. Because that is the fatal flaw with all those who proclaim themselves to be mighty. The fascists of old too believed themselves to be the strongest of the world until they were shown for what they really were: murderous and arrogant, only as strong as the willingness of their young men to kill their fellow man. And their young men would be killed by other young men until we stop with killing. Every empire too shall turn to dust, like the Qing Chinese before it, and the Romans before it, and the Egyptians before it. Do millions now worship the Pharaoh for his enslavement of the Jews? No, they worship in spite of him. Do billions pray to Pontius Pilate as he washed his hands clean of his blood? No, they pray in spite of him. So who will believe the fascists when they say that they are mighty? Not me. Who will believe them when they wield the names of those who stood by the weakest while killing and maiming? Not me. Why would you believe that the ones who play golf with the Pharaoh could ever lead you out of bondage? Every empire will imagine itself to be the last, and then it crumbles, and a new order emerges. And whether that new order will be more righteous is up to us. But it is no easy feat. What does it mean then to live in times like ours, with the escalating violence and indignities, with the naked greed and corruption of character, with thieving machines that robs human joy in art? It's easy to lose any sort of humanity in man. But we must be vigilant in the face of uncertainty. To live in times like ours is to feel that violence and cruelty become mundane, despite their obvious horror to us. It is to live with an anxiety about what social order is next. Some will fight, and others will hide, and no response is more or less human. To live in times like ours is to feel comfortable illusions disappear while trying to create new ones. Because it seems as if humans, once they see that they will not be punished for greed or killing, kill and steal evermore. But in spite of this, we must figure out how to hold to account those who exploit us, be they any ruler in politics or business alike. We must not let their lack of morals taint us. They lie and cheat and steal, but they have no honest connections. For in their world, they are always next on the chopping block. It's a world of anxiety. We will continue to feel the joy of friendship, to raucously laugh, to give ourselves over to each other in the beautiful ways only we can. All of this despite our despair. But we will know that despair is never far. To live in times like ours is to feel the weight of mankind before us, the weight of every day that came after every crisis. To live in both courage and fear, whilst looking upon cruelty and greed, and feel that you're living in insane times. And which would mad a man more than all, to know all this, yet not know how to help it. It's difficult to make sense of a time like ours, yet we're forced to do so, lest we wither away. I hope you can find some solace and peace despite it all. Thanks for watching.